Hey guys, Marsnaken here, bringing you another Dragon Ball Z Dokkan battle video. And so as the end of the year draws to a close and the game is pretty dry with content, we are going to be doing a few different tier lists. I already did the top 10 quote-unquote Dokkan Fest TURs. I have to say quote-unquote because I put Vegito and Rose in there. Most people didn't really seem to disagree with them being put into the list. Obviously, some people disagreed with their placements, and we had some interesting discussions and some interesting comments on that video. So, just like I said at the start of that last video, if you haven't seen it, I always say this on all of my tier list videos. So, I rank my units based on my own personal experience, which means we are always talking about units that are only available on global. If you think a unit is better because of a buff they've received from a unit that's going to come out, soon, that's out on JP and not on global, obviously that won't be taken into consideration because they're not out in the version of the game that I play. And we'll do an updated one in the future when those units come out and maybe the positions will change. But yeah, they're all based on my own personal experience. Your experience might differ, so, you guys might have different opinions out there. I said it in the last video and you guys all did very well, so, shout out to you guys, proud of you. Feel free to disagree down below in the comments. Just keep it chill, keep it respectful. I'm more than happy to reply to people's comments and discuss more reasons behind my placements. Obviously, I explain them in the video as it is anyway. And again, just like the first list, whilst it takes some time to make these lists, because I really have to think about the ranking, like what I consider the ranking criteria, because even myself, when I put a list together, I might put someone in a certain position and say, in my own head, it might be like, well, I've marked this person down a slot or two because of this particular reason. And then another unit that's higher than them might have a sort of very similar reason, but then something else they have kind of outweighs it, and then they end up slightly higher, right? So at the end of the day, I'm not perfect. It's just my opinion. If your opinion is different, like I say, let's discuss it down below in the comment section, but keep it chill. Let me know what your top 10 list would be. But this is the top 10 EZA TURs. I'm sure you all knew that from the title and the thumbnail anyway. So there won't be any LRs on the list. I am including units that aren't Dokkan Fest exclusives, but kind of like with the top 10 list we did before, we put Vegito and Rose in there, but there's not really many other TURs who would be considered like in the top 10 anyway. And when it comes to EZAs, there's probably not many non-Dokkan Fest exclusive EZAs that could make their way into the top 10, but realistically there probably are one or two. There may even be some that I've forgotten about that you guys think should be on the list, so let me know what you think down below. So we're starting off at number 10. This was one of the hardest ones I think for me to add in, because I feel like I was fairly confident on who I wanted on the list until I got to the last slot. And then I really wasn't sure who to put in number 10. So in number 10, we have the Super Saiyan Gogeta, who obviously transforms into the blue Gogeta. Now, the reason why he's on the list is he's obviously got good links, he's on good teams, he's got that built-in dodge. It's kind of like the reason why UI Goku stayed relevant for so long, right? Like, if you get the good RNG, this guy just dodges most of the time. He's doing some decent numbers. Like, attack stat-wise, he's obviously nothing crazy anymore, but still does good numbers. Gets guaranteed crits as well as being effective against all types. So, like, he does a ton of... Actually, no, he's not effective against all types, is he? He's just guaranteed crit. I always get my Gogeta passives confused, but he gets guaranteed crits. He can do some pretty solid damage. He's got links with, like, God Goku, the Blue Boys, like some of these God links that give those extra damage, like Warrior Gods, obviously being a link that at level 10 is giving an extra 15% attack when you get to the super, which is the main thing, right? He can still be pretty good, but obviously in the difficult content now, if he's not dodging, he's getting slapped around pretty hard, which is unfortunate, but he's definitely still usable as long as you get the good RNG. Like I said, I'm not 100% sold on him being number 10. If there's a unit you think that should be in this place instead of him, let me know. And I potentially would agree with some of the picks, but he's the guy I slotted in here for the final slot. And let's move on to number 9. So number 9, we have our first non-Dokkan Fest exclusive, which is the Int Demon Goddess Towa from the recent Heroes batch of EZAs. Now, I could be considered to put her slightly higher on the list, depending on the event or the situation, but one of the things about her that I think is really, really good compared to some of the Heroes units is she's not restricted to being on a Heroes unit whatsoever. She provides a ton of support. So any extreme teams that you can run her on, she's going to be juicing everybody up with all these extra stats. When you drop below 50% HP, she gives you the 50% heal, as well as giving an extra attack and defense 60% to extreme allies, which can make allies on that turn absolutely ridiculous. And then this last part of her passive, I feel like if they hadn't given her that, her EZA would have just been significantly less impressive, and she might not even have made it onto this list. But she has the additional attack and defense 40% with each attack evaded, which means once she's dodged 3 attacks, I've seen turns of her where she's at like 600k defense start of turn, she's hitting like 9 million attack stats, which for a support unit that's just there in slot 3, I feel like that is pretty good, right? She has a 50% chance to dodge. She obviously then has, you ideally give her a full dodge build in the hidden potential. So I've gone through whole runs of the difficult events, even like Fusion Zamasu, right, who's physical in his final phase, where she just dodges everything. Gives everyone a ton of support. The heal comes in clutch. One thing I think that prevents her from being a bit higher is it is unfortunate she only gets that 50% chance to dodge when you're above 50% HP. So if she comes onto the turn and you're below that HP threshold, she gives you the heal, which is awesome, but then she doesn't have her dodge. So depending on the event, especially if you are fighting a physical boss, you could potentially then be in a spot of trouble. But I think she's very, very good. Like I said, I could even be persuaded for her to be slightly higher on the list, but she is at number 9 for me currently. So now we'll move on to number 8. Number 8 is Blue Kaioken Goku. Now, I feel like this is the first big one where people will have some disagreements, mainly because I think the reason why he's this low is just because of his lack of teams and setups at the moment for the current meta. Like, if you, let's say you want to run him in Fusion Zamasu, like, who are you running with him to actually get his full potential, right? You've kind of got to risk, like, running the UI Gokus and just hoping they dodge everything. Now, obviously on JP, there is the int androids, but as I said at the beginning, they're not out on global, so we're not considering them. And yeah, I mean, like, I've run him on teams. When he got his EZA, I did showcase videos where we used him with just one Universe Survival Saga ally, so he's able to get that guard and then launches an additional super, and he can put out some pretty solid numbers. You're basically just missing out on the Spirit Bomb, essentially. But the problem is, he needs that Universe ally to be on rotation with him in order to trigger that thing for him to get those buffs for, it's like 5 turns, right? So if you're running one other ally on the team, like a popular choice is MVP 17 on some of his other teams, but because we can't pick our starting rotations, and, you know, all the hardest defense, well, for the most part, are limited attempts per day, if you jump into a run and, like, Kaioken Goku's on turn 1 and MVP 17's on turn 2, then he's significantly worse, right, without that ally with him for the first turn. So on his best turns, with his actual, like, optimal setup, he can be really, really good, and I could easily see him being higher up the list. But just at the moment, he doesn't have those meta-relevant, like, partners to make him really good. Now, obviously, as we said, the int androids are a thing, or will be in the future for global. A lot of people are not expecting, but, you know, speculating about Tournament of Power related anniversary again for the 9th anniversary, maybe a new UI Goku. Obviously the existing LR UI Goku and Blue Evolution Vegeta should be getting their EZAs. So once that happens, I can see this guy jumping up the list pretty significantly. But for the way it stands right now and how he fares in this difficult content, like without having these other allies around him, I think this is where I would put him at the moment. So he's at number 8, and then number 7, funnily enough, we've obviously just mentioned him, is MVP 17. Now, originally when I was making the list, I thought about having MVP 17 below Kaioken Goku because, you know, we all know at his heights, Kaioken Goku, even with just the one ally, right, he can hit some pretty crazy attack stats, especially if you are getting those additional supers early on. But with all the points I made about his team not being particularly good or anything like that, obviously Android 17 is a bit more versatile, right? He doesn't require any specific allies. He has seen some buffs, obviously, now with the release of Android 21 and the EZA for the LR androids. I mean, this guy next to the LR androids, they give each other a ton of support, they activate a ton of links, He can hit reasonably high attack stat numbers, considering I would consider his role is he's just a support unit, right? But he can still hit some pretty good damage numbers. Is giving everybody a very large amount of defense, and it's all allies support, so he can be very good on a bunch of different teams. He has a little bit of damage reduction, which, you know, it doesn't make a huge difference against some of these really big boss super attacks. But obviously, if you are below 77% HP at the start of the turn, he gets an additional 40% damage reduction, as well as giving all allies and himself a little bit of extra defense. And once he's got that active, he actually can tank some of these big supers, right? He raises defense on super, so if you're running him in slot 3, he's going to have that active when he's getting hit for the most part. Against AoEs, I mean, obviously he is physical, so he gets that little bit of an advantage against Fusion Zamasu, the little bit of damage reduction. So he's not going to be getting destroyed by AoEs, but especially if, you know, if start of turn you have his full damage reduction, then he'll be fine. But yeah, I think he's just very, very good. I think at this point in the meta, he is just above Kaioken Goku simply for the versatility of the teams that he's on. But obviously that could change in the future. Although at the same time, you know, Reps or Universe 7 getting, or Universe Survival Saga getting big buffs is also just helpful for him too, right? Because it's another team that he can be on. When the int androids come out, they're obviously decent together, even though ideally they're both kind of floating support units, but they can be very good together as well. So, you know, 17 in a pretty good spot at the moment, only with potential buffs to come. So definitely in a good spot here at number 7. So then we move on to number 6. So at number 6, I have Physical Piccolo. Again, I feel like people might think maybe he's a bit low, but I think the main reason for it is because as we've moved into now this meta where events are shorter and harder right from the start, Piccolo really does need to build up to get to the kind of numbers where he's comfortably tanking everything. And of course, he is a bit RNG related at the start, right? You know, launches an additional attack that has a medium chance to become a super, and only when HP is 77% or more, which is very easy to drop below with how difficult the content is now. So there's multiple turns, you know, you want him to get as many stacks as possible early on, but you will see turns where he's just doing a super attack and then maybe an additional normal or two, and then, you know, he's obviously not going to be as good. But the permanent scouter is, I think, one of the reasons why he stays so high up the list. I think if he didn't have the scouter, I would probably have him, I think I would comfortably say he'd be below 17 and probably even Kaioken Goku if he didn't have the scouter. But the scouter, very, very important tech. You know, even with him being a little bit weaker at the start of these tough events, at least he's showing you where the super attack is. So for the most part, you're not going to be putting him in front of it, right? So he's going to be a little bit protected there. And then if you do get the good RNG and he gets a bunch of additional supers, he can build his defense up fairly quickly. But yeah, he's overall still very solid. Some of the big bosses in the game at the moment being int helps him out as well, just like MVP 17. But I could see him dropping down this list as, you know, the content continues to get harder and some of the units below him, especially 17 and Goku, get those buffs for their teams. But for the moment, I would say I would consider him at 6 overall, right? So now we move into the top 5. I have Beerus at number 5. So I think he is... I went back and forth a little bit, but I think he is probably better than Piccolo in the current meta. Mainly because of, again, talking about how difficult content is right from the very start. So you put this guy in slot 1, he's able to be very good defensively before he attacks, right? He's got 70% damage reduction as long as you're picking up the 7 orbs, which... Now, the big problem is, the biggest difficult content at the moment, you are fighting Realm of Gods enemies in the last few stages. So that obviously helps him out massively because he creates rainbow orbs. But against non-Realm of Gods content, like when his EZA came out and we did showcases against Sin and stuff like that, he can struggle a little bit if he's not getting those orbs. So I think if we were to get the next, like, Red Zone, and it's not Realm of Gods enemies, and, you know, it's on the same level or even harder as the Dismal Future one, which is what we would expect, I could see this guy dropping down the list just because of him not being anywhere near as effective in those events. And of course, you have to remember as well, the extra damage reduction that he gets from the 7 orbs is only before attacking. So even against the Realm of Gods enemy, where we get the 7 orbs, he gets the extra damage reduction, You can super attack with him, does very good damage, and then he gets super attacked by some of these bigger bosses, even like, you know, Tech, Rose, and Zamasu. Goku Black is STR in phase 1. These units, if they super him after he's attacked, he's still taking a lot of damage. And then I think the other thing that holds him back a little bit from the units that I've put above him is his Link set as well. Now, if we were to get a new, you know, Dokkan Fest or Carnival LR, or even just a really powerful side banner unit for a Whis, then I think he would be in a much better spot. But he just really needs a much better Link partner. And then I think we could potentially consider him maybe 1 or 2 spots higher up the list. But for now, I've got him at number 5. I do think he is very good. Hopefully we get more Realm of Gods buffs. Like I say, a new Whis of some kind would be very good for him. I still think he's a very good unit. Obviously, all these units on the list I think are good, right? They're in the top 10. And I feel like I should stress once again, like I think I mentioned it at the very beginning. I'll mention it at the end again, I'm sure. Like any of the units on this list, if you wanted to swap any of them around, like in the sense that you're just moving one up one and the one above down one, I probably wouldn't have many disagreements for most of this list. I've already mentioned, right, I went back and forth with a lot of these units of who should I put above the other one. Out of 2 specific units. So I think Beerus is in a pretty solid spot here. You could consider him higher than the next unit especially, but obviously I'll go into the reasons why he is above him. But yeah, I have him at number 5, and I think I'm happy with that for now, right? So moving on to number 4. This is where I put Physical Super Saiyan 4 Vegito. So Physical Super Saiyan 4 Vegito is ridiculously good. Obviously, his main draw comes from running him next to Limit Breaker Super Saiyan 4 Vegito. He gasses him up, so he's doing like multiple 14 million attack stat supers on turn 1. But this guy himself next to Limit Breaker Vegito is still then doing like a 10 or 11 million attack stat. He doesn't have any additional or anything in his passive, but if he's getting an additional super, like these are some big numbers that he's hitting. He's providing support to crossover and giant 8 power. But the thing is, he's not limited to those teams, right? Those are the units he provides support to, but you don't have to run him on those teams specifically. Now, after he got his EZA, he does get damage reduction per crossover or giant 8 power ally. So obviously, let's say for example you were running him on like a full Patara team and you have no crossover or giant 8 power allies, obviously he's going to be significantly worse because he's not having that damage reduction. He's only going to be, it's like him, right? So it'll be 5%, which I guess is still better than nothing, but obviously he is stronger on those other teams. But considering some of the units on the list that we've talked about already, who definitely need other teammates to be at their best, because I think one thing I could see people, especially people who are big on the damage, I could see people not being happy that this guy's so far above Kaioken Goku, but you know, Crossover's one of the best teams in the game at the moment, and Universe Survival Saga or Reps of Universe 7 isn't. So when that changes, maybe these placements will change, right? But for now, I think this guy's very, very good. He's greatly raising defense on Super, so post-Super, his defense is good. And then realistically, he's tanking most normals, especially if he is getting a decent amount of that damage reduction passive. But then when it comes to a Super, there's a lot of units on this list that will just die to a Super attack. And Vegito might die to some of the big boss super attacks, but he has a coin flip 50% chance to take 0 damage from any super attack, and then obviously do a little bit of damage in return. That return damage isn't really important, but it's the fact that you put a lot of these units on the list, even some of the units above him, but I think they're just kind of better overall, right? Some of the units above him on their worst turns are going to die to a super attack, whereas Vegito at least will always have a 50% chance to counter. And, you know, it's RNG, like, you might not get it in multiple runs in a row, and then he's going to seem worse overall, but I think having that extra chance to essentially take 0 damage from the hardest hitting attacks in the game is very, very good. So overall, I think he definitely is deserving of being in a high placement on the list. But as I said, right, if you want to put Beerus above him, I mean, even if you want to put Kaioken Goku above him, I don't really agree. But if we're talking about like their best turns, Vegito hits harder than Goku early on and can counter supers. But obviously Goku builds up to being able to do some pretty crazy numbers, and if we really are talking best teams and best turns, he does have the Spirit Bomb in his back pocket as well, so there is that. But for now, I have Vegito at number 4. I think he's very, very good. And if we are talking best teams and scenarios, you're running him next to Limit Breaker Vegito. So that rotation is just absolutely busted. So now we will move on to the top 3. So at number 3, I have Future Gohan. So Future Gohan is very, very good. I considered putting him at 2. But there's a couple of things that we'll go into here as we talk about him and the unit that I put above him. So he's a solid unit in his base form. He's greatly raising defense on super. He has pretty good stats. He has damage reduction when HP is 70% or less. And this is one of the things I think that sort of made me mark him down a little bit, is if you're not at 70% or less HP and you take like a big boss super attack, he is potentially just going to get one shot depending on the boss. Now, the great thing is the 70% or less, it can activate mid-turn. So you can actually get those situations where it activates like right before he's then going to take a big attack, and then he actually survives, which is really, really good. But obviously you have to take into account there are going to be turns where he's not going to have that damage reduction active, and then he is going to potentially take some big damage from some of these enemies' attacks. He supports Bond of Master and Disciple, which is a pretty good covering for a lot of decent units, especially because he's giving 50% support, which is really good. And then he has a high chance to guard when you have an ally whose name includes Trunks attacking in the same turn. So obviously, again, guard chance, we don't like guard chance, we like guaranteed guard. But having a chance to guard is definitely better than not having guard at all. But you have to have a Trunks and you have to have him on the rotation. Now, for a lot of the teams you're going to run this guy on, that's not a huge issue, but it does limit him a little bit. Not enough, obviously, to keep him, he's in the top 3 here, but I still think that is pretty solid. And then his transformation, you can only transform when there is a Trunks on the team. And when he transforms, then he becomes like incredibly good, right? He has the 50% damage reduction all the time. He gets extra stats per Bond of Master and Disciple in the turn. He gets additional attacks if you have a Trunks in the same turn. And if there's an Androids or Future Saga ally, so obviously in the newest content in the game, the hardest content, he's getting a lot of extra buffs. So if his transformation condition didn't require a Trunks, or, was just easier to get in general, I think maybe I would put him above the unit that I put at number 2. And as I've already said, right, with the whole switching positions, if you want to say, nah, Ningen, what are you talking about? This guy's easily better than who you've got at number 2, and this is why. Fair enough, right? But I think when you take into account the potential that on some teams, I don't know why I did that, I wouldn't do that. On some teams, you're not even going to get him to transform. So you're kind of always having to bring a Trunks if you want to get that transformation and, of course, the guard chance. But he's very, very good, right? So, if you want to put him higher, I wouldn't complain. I think he's very good. But yeah, he is at number 3. Moving on to number 2. So this is the one I feel like I'm interested to see what people's reaction is to who I have at number 2. So number 2, we have the Dark Mask King. So yes, it's a heroes unit, but hold off, don't go crazy in the comments just yet. I'm not just overly glazing a heroes unit, which sometimes I do, but this guy is actually incredible. Like, there are a few instances, like I'll say stuff in showcases when a unit is really good, where I'll have those moments of the kind of like, whoa, like wide-eyed face. And I'll say things like, damn, I didn't expect like that kind of number or anything. But with this guy, I could genuinely say my reaction to using him after his EZA was I actually blown away at how good he is. We have had situations against like physical Fusion Zamasu where this guy lives a super attack in slot 1 and then crits on his super attack and heals you back to full health. There's not many other units in the game that are doing that. Now, there are certain situations he does need to get hit in order to get a big defense buff for 5 turns. So those situations can occur where you get to the turn where that buff has run out, and then the first hit of the turn he takes is a super, and he takes a lot of damage. And we have seen recently doing some challenge runs against like Sin Shenron. In the final stage where he's physical, he also lowers defense on super. So if the first attack of the turn the Dark Mask King takes and he doesn't have that full buff is the super from physical Sin, I think he takes like 480k. And then depending on how many normal attacks follow that up, because his defense has been lowered, he still takes like 20 or 30k, I think. Now, on the current best version of the Heroes team, you can survive that as long as there are, only a few attacks that follow the super. Then he super attacks, but unfortunately in that scenario he has type disadvantage, so you kind of are relying on him to crit. But if he does, he then heals you a tremendous amount of that damage I built mine is an int unit, so he only has 5 dodge as standard. I didn't give him any extra dodge. All the rest is additional and crit. Because you get those turns where he does like double supers and one of them is a crit, and you're back on full HP. So he's absolutely ridiculous. Now, when it comes to his restrictions, like we talked about Gohan needing a Trunks, he just needs a heroes unit in the same turn with him, and then he has guard, which is obviously a very powerful mechanic, as well as an extra 100% defense. But you think about, if you're running him in slot 1, any other heroes unit you could just run next to him, right? Rose, even Vegito, right? They're not going to share a lot of links, but they got prepared for battle at the very minimum. He doesn't need a lot of links active, right? And then whoever you're putting him in slot next to him in slot 2, they can get links from the unit that's in slot 3, and Dark Mask King's just kind of chilling in slot 1. So when trying to think about where to put him on the list, I didn't want to put him too high because I know people will say that he's only that high because he's a heroes unit. But when I look at some of the reasons why I put units in the other slots, like this guy is just doing a lot of those things better than them, right? Like, for example, let's take Beerus, just off the top of my head. In slot 1, if you got all of his orbs, he's probably taking less damage than the Dark Mask King from most attacks. But then after he's attacked, he can be pretty vulnerable. Whereas Dark Mask King, you know, he's got his guard. If he's been hit already, he's got that extra defense. He raises defense on super. But if he's been hit in slot 1, he might take a little bit more damage than Beerus, but then he attacks and potentially heals you all of that damage back. So that is pretty crazy. And then when it comes to future Gohan, like I said, right, if we get into a turn, let's say turn 1 against Fusion Zamasu, if Fusion Zamasu supers Gohan and we're not at 70% or less HP, Gohan dies to that super, whereas the Dark Mask King doesn't die to that super. And then if it is in slot 1, I mean, obviously that comparison, I wouldn't necessarily use a slot 1 comparison for him versus Gohan, because you're probably never putting Gohan in slot 1, but Dark Mask King is going to heal. But let's say we're talking about them in slot 2, Dark Mask King will take less damage if Gohan didn't have his damage reduction, and if he's already attacked at that point, we're probably on full HP. So, you know, like I said, if you think he should be lower, let me know why down below. But just with all of the stuff that I've seen out of him, I think he easily is one of the best EZAs for a TUR. I honestly genuinely toyed with the idea of putting him at number 1. And as we go on to discuss the unit at number 1, who I'm pretty sure you all know who it is at this point, considering we haven't mentioned him yet, there are honestly still times when I would say he probably could be better than him. So moving on to number 1, we of course have AGL Zamasu. Now Zamasu, the thing that makes me consider putting Dark Mask King at number 1 is that on turn 1, Zamasu is not particularly great, right? He has okay start of turn defense, he has 40% damage reduction, which is good, and he's raising defense on super. He recovers HP at the start of the turn, and then at the end of the turn, which is really good. So I feel like turn 1 is kind of his only weak turn, and even then he's only really weak to like a super, right? If as long as he's attacked first, his defense is going to be pretty good for taking normals. I guess if he takes an AoE before he supers, he can still take a little bit of damage as well, but he's going to be healing at the end of the turn. He'll be tanking most normals perfectly fine. And then, of course, he then transforms into the Fusion Zamasu. And this is where I think if we're just arguing this guy versus the Dark Mask King, I would say this is why this guy's at number 1. Because he has the higher stats, he has 50% damage reduction, he can do some really good numbers, launches an additional attack if he's been hit first, he recovers HP a ton, he just is really, really strong, right? Like, we've had turns of him where he's putting out multiple, like, 11, 12, 13 million attack stats, which is the one big thing, right? The Dark Mask King, after his EZA, they did give him a lot of extra damage potential, so I think on his best turns, I've seen him hit, like, 6, 7 million attack, potentially even up to 8 with support. But like, this guy's obviously hitting way, way harder, and post super he's got a ton of raw defense and 50% damage reduction. So I think in most cases, if we were to take like 50 different turns just plucked randomly out of the game, I think on more of those turns Fusion Zamasu would be better than the Dark Mask King, which is why I think he should be at number 1. And then obviously you have the opportunity for the finisher, where you mutate into the big purple arm Zamasu. He loses a bit of his defensive capability, but ideally you're using these in the final phases of bosses where only Sin or Omega is still doing AoEs, and then he just does a big supercharged attack. potentially does multiple of them and just does tons of damage, right? So he easily out damages Dark Mask King. On his best turns, he is better defensively. He's still healing a little bit throughout his transformations, so he's doing a lot of things that the Dark Mask King does. I think the only main advantage the Dark Mask King has is that ability to go in slot 1, defend very well, and then heal you afterwards, which is such a huge bonus to a lot of these teams. But yeah, I think Zamasu just about goes over Dark Mask King into number 1. But honestly, on his best day, I feel like I would want to argue Dark Mask King as number 1. But I think Zamasu just has a little bit too much going for him. And again, like I said already, Future Gohan could easily have arguments, especially on his best turns, to be better than the Dark Mask King as well. But I do feel like these guys are the top 3. Even like Vegito, who I put at number 4, when the EZAs first dropped, I was so impressed with him next to Limit Breaker Vegito that I thought, oh, well, you know, he's obviously the best EZA, and the Dark Mask King is probably the second best. But I don't know. I think the top 4 could be a bit interchangeable. But let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. If we just jump over here to see the list in full. This is what the list looks like from 1 to 10. So starting from number 10, reverse order, AGL Gogeta, Int Darkness Towa, STR Kaioken Goku, Physical MVP 17, Physical Piccolo, Physical Beerus, Physical Super Saiyan 4 Vegito, Int Future Gohan, Int Dark Mask King, and AGL Zamasu. So let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. As I've said multiple times, I feel like any of these units could be switched around a little bit. I'm interested to hear what you guys think down below. Keep it chill. Let's discuss. What's your top 10? How is it different from mine? What do you think? Let me know in the comment section. So that is going to be it for the video, guys. This has been The Masked Ningen. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new. Check out the links down below for the Discord and the merch store, and I will see you all again soon. Have a good one.